In 1901, French police broke down an attic door in the city of Poitiers. Inside, they found a woman lying naked on a rotten mattress. Her hair reached her ankles. She weighed 25 kilograms, 55 pounds. Her own mother had locked her in that room for 25 years because she wanted to marry the wrong man. The woman's name was Blanche Monnier. The man she had loved was a lawyer named Victor Calmel. He had spent the last decade of his life searching for her. He died in 1885, still looking. He died not knowing that she was, the entire time, less than 2 miles from his office, locked in an attic in her own family's home, alive, lucid, counting the days. 25 years, 9,125 days, no sunlight, no bath, no human conversation that lasted longer than the seconds it took for a servant to push a tray of scraps through the door. When the police finally found her, her first words were not a scream. They were not a cry for help. She looked up at the officer standing in the door, and she said, "How lovely, the fresh air." This is the story of how an aristocratic French family hid a captive in their own home for a quarter of a century. How an entire town pretended it had never happened. How a single anonymous letter, written by someone whose identity has never been discovered, finally opened the door. And how the man who had been complicit in the entire thing, Blanche's brother Marcel, walked out of court a free man and inherited the house she had been imprisoned in. I need to stop here, because most retellings of this story get one detail wrong. They treat what happened to Blanche Monnier as the work of one cruel mother, a single villain in a Gothic novel. But that is not what makes this case extraordinary. What makes it extraordinary is that for 25 years, an entire town pretended it had never happened. An aristocratic family, a respected mother, a successful brother, a household full of servants. Neighbors on every side, postmen, butchers, dressmakers, priests, all of them, in different ways, knew something was wrong in that house. And not one of them said anything. Until one day, in 1901, somebody finally did. And the letter they wrote is still, more than a century later, a complete mystery. Because nobody, in all the years of investigation that followed, has ever been able to identify who wrote it. So, before we get back to what the police found in the attic that morning, you need to understand who Blanche Monnier was before she vanished. You need to understand the family she was born into. The mother who would do this. The brother who would let it happen. Because the story of how she ended up in that room begins with the most ordinary thing imaginable. A young woman, a young man her family did not approve of, and a single argument in 1876 that lasted in its consequences for the rest of her life. Blanche Monnier was born on March 1st, 1849, in Poitiers, France. She was the second child of Charles-Émile Monnier and Louise Monnier. Her older brother Marcel was 3 years old when she was born. The Monnier were old money, not the new industrial wealth that was rising in France during the Second Empire. They were aristocracy. Their family name was tied to land and title going back centuries. They lived in a 3-story manor on Rue de la Visitation, in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. Charles-Émile, Blanche's father, was the dean of the Faculty of Letters at the University of Poitiers, a man of letters, a respected academic. He stayed largely out of public life. Louise, the mother, did not. Madame Louise Monnier was, by every contemporary account, the most powerful woman in Poitiers society. She hosted the most important salons. She controlled the most important charity boards. Her opinion could make a young man's career or destroy it. The mayors, the judges, the priests, the military officers stationed in the region, they all came through her parlor. And she had 2 ambitions in life. The first was to maintain the Monnier name. The second was to marry her daughter into a family of equivalent status. Blanche was, by her early 20s, the most sought-after young woman in Poitiers. Witnesses described her as exceptionally beautiful. She was a trained pianist. She read in 3 languages. She was, in the language of the time, an ornament. Suitors came from across France. The most prominent bachelors in Bordeaux, Lyon, even Paris, made the journey to Poitiers to call on her. Louise approved of none of them. The men who came were not, in her opinion, of the right family, or the right fortune, or the right political alignment. She rejected them, one by one, often in front of Blanche. The message was clear. Louise would choose. Blanche would marry the man Louise chose, and Blanche would marry no one else. Then, in 1875, a man named Victor Calmel began calling at the house. Calmel was a lawyer in Poitiers. He was older than Blanche. He was not aristocratic. He was not wealthy. He had been to good schools. He worked, by all accounts, with diligence and integrity. He represented common cases, property disputes, inheritance claims. He was, in every measurable way, beneath the Monnier family's expectations. But Blanche fell in love with him. She was 26 years old. By the standards of her time, she was approaching the end of her marriageable years. She told her mother, in early 1876, that she intended to marry Victor Calmel. Louise refused. The argument that followed was loud enough that the household servants later told police they had heard it from the kitchen 2 floors below. Louise told Blanche that she would never marry a penniless lawyer. Blanche told her mother that she would marry whom she chose. Louise told Blanche that no daughter of hers would shame the Monnier name by marrying down. The argument continued for weeks. Blanche refused to break the engagement. Louise refused to permit it. And then, in the early summer of 1876, Louise Monnier solved the problem. Here is what we know about how it happened. One evening in 1876, Louise asked Blanche to come up to the attic with her. The attic of the Monnier house was a small, low-ceilinged room with a single window. The window had heavy wooden shutters. When Blanche entered the room, Louise stepped out and closed the door. She locked it from the outside. Then she went downstairs. Blanche, 27 years old, healthy, beautiful, lucid, was now a prisoner in her own home. The official story Louise gave to anyone who asked was that Blanche had become mentally unwell and had been sent to a sanatorium in the south of France for treatment. Some versions of the story said she had run away to England. Some said she had become a nun. The story changed depending on who was asking. What did not change was that Blanche was no longer in society. Victor Calmel, the lawyer she had wanted to marry, did not believe the family's stories. He went to the house. He demanded to see her. He was turned away. He went to her friends. They knew nothing. He hired investigators in Paris. They could find no record of Blanche Monnier at any sanatorium in France. He kept searching for 9 years. In 1885, Victor Calmel died of a sudden illness. He had never married. He had spent the last decade of his life trying to find Blanche. He died believing she had been institutionalized somewhere, hidden by her family, beyond his reach. He died not knowing that she was, the entire time, less than 2 miles from his office, locked in an attic in her parents' house. Inside that attic, Blanche's life had become a routine of darkness. The shutters on the window were never opened. The room was lit, when it was lit at all, by a single oil lamp brought in by a servant. Food was passed through the door. The food was scraps, bread crusts, soup remnants, sometimes meat, often spoiled. Blanche was given no utensils. She ate with her hands. She was given no water for washing. She was given no chamber pot. She was given no sheets. She slept on a straw mattress on the floor. The mattress was never changed. The servants who delivered the food were sworn to secrecy. Anyone who asked questions was dismissed. Over the 25 years of her captivity, the Monnier household went through dozens of staff. Most of them, the police would later determine, knew. They had heard her. They had smelled the room. They had seen the locked door. They said nothing because their employment, and often their family's employment, depended on their silence. In 1879, 3 years into her captivity, Charles-Émile Monnier, Blanche's father, died. He had never visited the attic. Whether he objected to what his wife had done or whether he agreed with it has never been clear. He was dismissed from his post as dean in 1877 during a political crisis, and he spent the last 2 years of his life in declining health, speaking little. After Charles-Émile's death, the Monnier household consisted of Louise, her son Marcel, and the rotating staff. Marcel had become a successful lawyer. He had married. He kept a separate residence next door to his mother. He was, by every account, fully aware of what was happening in the attic. He visited the house every day. He sometimes brought his children. His children were never told that their aunt was upstairs. The years passed, 5, 10, 15, 20. Blanche, in the attic, stopped speaking. She stopped eating consistently. Her weight dropped to 25 kilograms, 55 pounds. Her hair grew to her ankles. Her fingernails curled into spirals. She did not, however, lose her mind. This is the detail that changes the story. When investigators interviewed her in 1901, after her rescue, she was lucid. She remembered her own name. She remembered her parents' names. She remembered Victor Calmel. She remembered the date she had been locked in the attic. She remembered what she had been wearing. For 25 years, she had counted the days. She had recited the names of everyone she had ever known in order every morning to keep her memory functional. She had kept herself alive by an act of will. And then, in May of 1901, somebody wrote a letter. The commissioner of Poitiers arrived at the Monnier residence at 21 Rue de la Visitation at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on May 23, 1901. With him were 4 uniformed officers and a representative from the Paris prosecutor's office. The household servant who answered the door tried to refuse them entry. The servant told them Madame Monnier was unwell. The servant was overruled. The officers entered the house. They were met in the foyer by Marcel Monnier, 53 years old, who had been called from his neighboring residence. Marcel asked what they wanted. The officer in charge produced the anonymous letter and read it aloud. Marcel told the officers that the letter was a slander, that his sister had died years ago in a sanatorium in Switzerland, that he would not permit them to search his mother's home. The commissioner told Marcel that they had a warrant. Marcel asked to see it. The commissioner produced it. The officers began searching the house room by room. The ground floor, nothing. The first floor, nothing. As they climbed to the second floor, one of the officers noticed a smell. It was faint at first. By the time they reached the third floor landing, the smell was overpowering. It was coming from a single door at the end of the corridor. The door was secured with 3 padlocks. The officer demanded the key. The household servant produced one. It opened only the bottom lock. The other 2 locks required keys that the servant said had been lost. The officers broke the locks with iron bars. They opened the door. The first thing they noticed was the darkness. The room had a single window, but the shutters were closed and covered with a heavy curtain. The officers pulled back the curtain and opened the shutters. The light revealed what was inside. A bed, or what had been a bed. It was a straw mattress on the floor, blackened with 25 years of accumulated filth. Around it, on the floor, was a thick crust of decomposing food, human waste, oyster shells, fish bones, and rotting bread. Insects covered the floor and the bed. Rats were visible in the corners. On the bed was a woman. She was naked. Her hair, gray and matted, reached her ankles. Her fingernails curled in spirals. Her body was so thin that the officers, all hardened policemen, several of whom had served in the Franco-Prussian War, had to step out of the room to compose themselves. She was alive. She was awake. She covered her face from the light. Then she lowered her hand. She looked at the officers, and she said, in clear French, "How lovely, the fresh air." The officer who reached her first wrapped her in his coat. They carried her down the stairs. They put her in a carriage. They drove her to the Hotel Dieu Hospital in Poitiers. On the way to the hospital, Blanche Monnier, 52 years old, told the officer that she remembered him. She said his face looked like a man who had been a friend of her father's. The officer was 26 years old. The friend Blanche was remembering had died in 1873, before the officer was born. Her mind was holding a photograph of the world from 28 years ago. It was, in its own way, perfectly preserved. The arrest of Louise and Marcel Monnier took place that evening. Madame Louise Monnier, 75 years old, was found in her bedroom on the second floor of the house. When the officers told her she was under arrest, she said nothing. She allowed them to escort her downstairs. When they walked her out the front door, an angry mob had already gathered in the street. Word had spread through the neighborhood that something had happened at the Monnier house. Someone had seen the carriage that took Blanche to the hospital. Someone else had told a neighbor. Within an hour, the street was full of people. When the crowd saw Madame Monnier emerge from the house, they began to shout. They threw stones. They called her by names that no one in Poitiers had ever called her in her life. She collapsed in the street. The officers carried her to the carriage. She died 15 days later, in custody, before any formal trial could be held. The official cause of death was heart failure. Her doctors recorded that she had refused food for the last week of her life. Marcel Monnier was tried alone. The trial began in October of 1901. The prosecution called more than 40 witnesses, servants who had worked in the house, neighbors who had heard sounds, suppliers who had delivered food they could not account for. The case against Marcel was, on the surface, overwhelming. His defense was simple. He claimed that his sister was, and always had been, mentally ill. He claimed that the family had cared for her at home, in the attic, because institutional care at the time was inhumane and they could not bear to send her away. He claimed that the conditions in the room were the result of Blanche's own behavior, that she was incapable of self-care, that she refused to be moved or cleaned. He claimed his mother had been a saint who had sacrificed her own social standing to care for a damaged child. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Marcel was convicted. He was sentenced to 15 months in prison. The verdict was met with public outrage. 15 months for 25 years of imprisonment, less than 2 months for every year his sister had lost. Marcel appealed the verdict. The appeals court, in November of 1901, accepted his defense. The court ruled that there was insufficient evidence that Marcel personally had been responsible for Blanche's confinement, that his mother had been the primary actor, and that his mother was now dead. Marcel Monnier was acquitted. He walked out of court a free man. He returned to his legal practice. He inherited the entire Monnier estate after his mother's death, including the house at 21 Rue de la Visitation. He lived there until his own death many years later, in the same building where his sister had been imprisoned. Here is what almost no retelling of this story includes. Blanche Monnier never returned to the Monnier house. After her recovery in the hospital, she was transferred to the psychiatric facility at Blois, 300 kilometers north of Poitiers. She lived there for 12 more years. She died on October 13, 1913, at the age of 64. The medical staff at Blois recorded their observations of her over those 12 years. The records are still preserved. They describe her as gentle, as lucid in conversation, as able to remember her childhood with remarkable detail, as fond of music, particularly of Chopin, which she would listen to for hours with her eyes closed. She never asked in 12 years of medical interviews why her mother had done what she had done. She never asked what had happened to Victor Calmet, the lawyer she had loved. The hospital staff, on instructions from her doctors, never told her that he had died in 1885. In her last years, she was given paper and pen. She wrote, the staff recorded hundreds of pages. After her death, the pages were collected by the hospital and stored in the archive. They were lost during the Second World War, when the facility was occupied by German forces and many of its records were destroyed. What she wrote in those 12 years is unknown. It will never be recovered. The author of the anonymous letter that triggered her rescue was never identified. For more than 120 years, French historians, journalists, and police archivists have tried to determine who wrote the letter. The handwriting did not match any of the household staff who could be traced. It did not match the handwriting of any neighbor, supplier, or visitor who is known to have entered the house. It did not match the handwriting of any of Marcel Monnier's law clients or political enemies. The letter was written by someone who knew the precise duration of Blanche's captivity. 25 years, exact. Not many years, or a long time, but the actual number. There are perhaps 3 people in the world who could have known that number with that precision. One was Blanche herself. One was her mother Louise. One was her brother Marcel. It is possible, some historians have suggested, that the letter was written by Marcel. That after 25 years of complicity, of carrying his mother's secret, of inheriting his sister's locked door as an inevitability, he could no longer carry it. That he wrote the letter himself. That he sent it to Paris, anonymously, knowing what would happen, knowing that the prosecutor would have to act, knowing that the door would be opened. That he chose, after a quarter of a century, to end it. There is no evidence that this is true. There is also no evidence that it is not. The letter is in the French National Archives. The handwriting analysis is inconclusive. The mystery remains. So here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. If you had been Marcel Monnier, knowing what your mother had done, knowing that your sister was in the attic of your own house, knowing that exposing the truth would destroy your family's name forever, would you have written the letter? Or would you have kept the door locked? There is no right answer. The case has no clean ending. Most of the people who could have answered the question are dead. But the door, in the end, was opened. Somebody made that choice. We just don't know who. If this is the kind of history they never taught you in school, the dark, the strange, the stories that do not have clean endings, subscribe to Dark Histories. New videos every week. The next one is darker than this.